I still remember the sound of the auditorium doors closing behind me that night, not because they were loud, but because no one was on the other side. That's when it finally sank in that I had been holding my breath for weeks for people who were never planning to show up. I'm Nico, I'm 18, and up until that moment, I kept telling myself my family loved me equally. They just had different ways of showing it. I was wrong, and that night was the first time I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I grew up in what everyone on the outside would probably call a good family. 2 parents, a nice house, regular dinners, no shouting matches that neighbors could hear. My dad liked to brag that we were stable, that we didn't have drama like other families. My mom would nod along, smiling, always saying how lucky we were. And for a long time, I believed it. Or maybe I just didn't know what unfairness looked like when it was wrapped in polite words and quiet disappointment. I'm the younger sibling. My brother, Adrian, is 5 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, he was the center of gravity in our house. Everything seemed to orbit around him. His school, his sports, his internships, his potential. When Adrian walked into a room, my parents straightened up a little, like they were being evaluated. When I walked in, they'd glance up and ask if I'd finished my homework. It wasn't that they were openly cruel to me. That's what made it confusing. They didn't yell. They didn't insult me outright. They just missed things. My things. A lot. Parent-teacher meetings where my mom forgot the time. Art shows where my dad said parking was too hard. Birthdays that got folded into someone else's schedule because Adrian had something important going on. I learned early not to make a big deal out of it. I learned to shrug and say, it's fine, even when it wasn't. The thing is, theater was the one place where I felt like I mattered. I wasn't the loudest kid or the most confident, but on stage, I could be someone else. I could be heard. I started acting in middle school, small roles at first, then bigger ones. By high school, it wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was the thing that kept me going. Rehearsals after school, weekends spent memorizing lines, late nights running scenes over and over until my voice went hoarse. I wasn't chasing fame or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted to do something that felt like it belonged to me. My senior year play was different. It wasn't just another production. It was my final one. The last time I'd be on that stage with the same people I'd grown up with. I had a major role, not the lead, but close enough that I was on stage for most of the show. Teachers kept telling us to invite our families. This is a big one, they said. You'll remember this forever. I took that to heart. I told my parents about the dates months in advance. I put the flyer on the fridge. I reminded them at dinner. I even wrote the performance dates on our shared family calendar, the one my mom swore by. Every time I brought it up, my mom would smile and say, "Of course we'll be there, honey." My dad would nod and add something like, "Wouldn't miss it." Those words mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. Adrian, meanwhile, had just started climbing the corporate ladder at whatever company he worked for. I never fully understood what his job was, just that it involved emails, meetings, and a lot of talk about opportunities. Everything he did was framed as serious and important. When he called our parents, they'd put him on speaker and listen like he was giving a keynote speech. When I talked about rehearsals, they'd smile politely and ask if I'd considered something more practical for college. A week before opening night, my dad announced at dinner that Adrian had gotten a promotion. He said it like it was a national holiday. My mom clapped her hands together and immediately started talking about celebrating. Adrian wasn't even there, but you would have thought he was sitting at the head of the table. They talked about dinners, reservations, inviting relatives. I sat there quietly, pushing food around my plate, a small knot forming in my stomach. I reminded them, carefully, that opening night was that same week. My mom paused, fork halfway to her mouth, and said, "Oh, right. But that's on Friday, isn't it?" I nodded. She glanced at my dad. They exchanged one of those looks, silent, quick, practiced. My dad said they'd figure it out. That should have been my warning. The day of the performance arrived faster than I expected. I spent the afternoon at school, nerves buzzing under my skin. The cast was energized, everyone talking too fast, laughing too loud. Backstage smelled like dust and makeup and old curtains. I checked my phone more times than I care to admit. No messages. No good luck. No, we're on our way. I texted my mom a simple reminder. Show starts at 7. I'm nervous but excited. She replied 10 minutes later with a heart emoji and break a leg. It wasn't the same as seeing them in the seats, but I told myself it was fine. Maybe they were just running late. As the audience started filing in, I peeked through the curtain. I scanned the rows instinctively, my eyes trained on the spots where my parents usually sat for school events. Empty. I felt a small jolt of panic, quickly buried under the adrenaline of the moment. People are late sometimes, I told myself. Traffic happens. The show began. The lights hit me, and for a while, everything else faded. I delivered my lines, moved through scenes, felt the familiar rush of being completely present. The audience laughed at the right moments, applauded when they were supposed to. From the outside, it probably looked like a great night. Inside, though, I kept counting scenes, kept thinking, maybe they'll come during intermission. Maybe they're just grabbing seats quietly. When intermission came, I rushed backstage and checked my phone again. Still nothing. I texted my dad this time. Hey, are you guys here? No reply. The second half of the play felt heavier. I missed a cue I'd never missed before. My hands shook during a scene that was supposed to be calm. I pulled it together because that's what you do on stage, but something had cracked. When the final curtain fell and the audience stood to applaud, I bowed with everyone else, smiling so hard my face hurt. Afterward, the cast met their families in the lobby. Parents hugged their kids, took photos, cried a little. I stood off to the side, holding my costume bag, pretending to be busy on my phone. People asked where my family was. I laughed it off. They couldn't make it, I said, like it was no big deal. It was a big deal. When I finally got home later that night, still in that weird emotional fog, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. My parents were there, along with Adrian. There were takeout containers on the counter and an open bottle of something expensive my dad saved for special occasions. Adrian was mid-story, talking about his boss, his promotion, his future. They looked happy, relaxed, like they'd just come from something that mattered. My mom noticed me first. Oh, how was the play? She asked, genuinely cheerful. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding, my head full of everything I hadn't said for years. I asked, quietly, why they hadn't come. My dad didn't even hesitate. He looked at me like I'd asked something unreasonable and said, "That's different, Nico. This actually matters." The room went silent, and something inside me shifted in a way I knew I wouldn't be able to undo. I didn't say anything right away after my dad dropped those words. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I suddenly had too much. It felt like every small moment I'd brushed off over the years lined up in my head all at once, like receipts I'd never asked for. I stood there, backpack still over one shoulder, makeup half wiped, the smell of stage dust still clinging to me, while my family waited for me to react in a way that wouldn't inconvenience them. My mom tried to smooth it over. She always did. She said something like, "You know what your father means," in that soft voice she used when she wanted things to go back to normal without actually fixing anything. Adrian avoided my eyes, suddenly very interested in his phone. No one apologized. No one even looked uncomfortable. That was the part that hurt the most. This wasn't a mistake to them. It was a decision. I went to my room that night and closed the door quietly, because slamming it would have made things dramatic. And being dramatic was apparently my biggest flaw. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I felt strangely calm, like something important had finally been clarified. I told myself I wouldn't bring it up again. I told myself I'd stop expecting things. That promise lasted maybe 3 days. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in the house shifted in small but noticeable ways. Adrian's promotion became the family's favorite topic. Relatives called. My parents retold the story like they'd personally earned the achievement. They framed his success as proof that their parenting worked. Every dinner somehow circled back to Adrian's future, where he might move, how much he might earn, what kind of life he was building. Meanwhile, my college application sat half-finished on my desk, untouched by anyone but me. Whenever I tried to talk about theater, about auditions, scholarships, programs, I got the same responses. "That's nice. Have you thought about a backup? It's good as a hobby." My dad started asking more pointed questions, like whether acting was just a phase or if I planned to grow out of it. My mom suggested I look into something more stable, preferably something that didn't involve all that uncertainty. I started to realize that missing my play wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most obvious one. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like pressure in a pipe you don't realize is about to burst. It was the way my dad started using Adrian as an example in every conversation. Your brother understood responsibility early, he'd say. Or, Adrian didn't waste time on distractions. Sometimes he'd say these things while I was sitting right there, as if I were invisible or too naive to notice the comparison. I tried, for a while, to earn back whatever invisible approval I'd lost. I helped more around the house. I kept my grades up. I stopped talking about theater unless someone asked. I even looked into other majors just to see if anything clicked. Nothing did. The more I bent, the smaller I felt. One afternoon, a few months after the play, my mom asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. That alone made my stomach drop. In our house, sit down meant something serious was coming. My dad was already there, arms crossed, expression neutral in that way that meant he'd already made up his mind. Adrian wasn't home, which should have been a relief, but somehow made it worse. My mom started by saying how proud they were of both of us. That was new. Suspiciously new. She talked about how hard parenting was, how they always tried to do what was best for the family as a whole. I listened, nodding when appropriate, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then my dad leaned forward and said they needed to talk about finances. I didn't see where this was going at first. He explained that with Adrian's new position, there were opportunities, investments, relocations, things that required family support. He said they'd been helping Adrian in small ways already, but now things were getting serious. My mom chimed in, mentioning how expensive the world was, how important it was to invest wisely in the child most likely to succeed. That phrasing stuck with me. The child most likely to succeed. Then they told me they were planning to use the college fund they'd set aside for me to help Adrian relocate closer to his job. It wasn't framed as a question. It was presented like a logical step everyone should understand. My dad said something about returns and long-term benefits. My mom said Adrian would pay them back eventually, once he was settled. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what they were saying. That fund wasn't huge, but it was the one concrete promise I'd held on to. The one thing that made me feel like they believed in my future, even if they didn't always show it. I asked, quietly, what that meant for me. My dad shrugged. You're creative, he said. You'll figure something out. I felt something snap inside my chest. Not explode, snap. Clean and sharp. I told them it wasn't fair. I reminded them that they'd promised that money was for my education. My mom frowned and said I was being selfish, that families made sacrifices for each other. My dad said I was overreacting and that Adrian needed it more right now. I asked them if they'd even talked to Adrian about it. My mom said of course they had. He was uncomfortable at first, apparently, but he understood. That detail hurt more than I expected. He knew. He knew and let it happen. I stopped arguing after that. There was no point. They'd already decided whose future mattered more. After that conversation, I pulled back emotionally in ways I don't think they noticed right away. I stopped sharing details about my life. I stayed late at school. I spent weekends at friends' houses. When my parents talked about Adrian, I listened silently. When they asked me how things were going, I gave vague answers. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It was survival. The real betrayal, the one that changed everything, came a few weeks later, on a day that started completely normal. I came home early from school because rehearsal had been canceled. The house was quiet, which was rare. As I walked past my parents' bedroom, I heard my dad's voice, low and serious, and my mom's softer replies. I wasn't trying to listen, but my name came up, and that made me stop. My dad said something about keeping Nico realistic. My mom replied that they needed to be careful with how they told me. Then my dad said the words that made my stomach drop. If he knows we already signed the papers, he'll make a scene. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Papers. Signed. Without me. Without even pretending to ask. I realized, in that moment, that missing my play hadn't just been about one night. It had been the start of something much bigger. Something that was already in motion, and I was the only one who hadn't been informed. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, knowing that whatever they'd decided for me, whatever they'd taken without asking, was about to come crashing down on me whether I was ready or not. I didn't confront them right away after overhearing that conversation. I wish I could say it was because I was being strategic or mature, but the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I was scared. Not of yelling or punishment, but of confirmation. Of hearing, out loud, exactly how little space I occupied in their plans. As long as I didn't ask, there was still a tiny part of me that could pretend I'd misunderstood. So I did what I'd always done best. I went quiet. The next few weeks felt like I was moving through fog. I went to school, smiled at the right times, laughed at jokes I barely heard. At home, I stayed in my room more. When my parents talked about logistics or paperwork or Adrian's timeline, I put my headphones on and turned the volume up. Theater, which had always been my escape, suddenly felt complicated. I still loved it, but it also reminded me of everything my family had dismissed. Every rehearsal felt bittersweet, like I was clinging to something already slipping away. The official confirmation came on a Tuesday night, casually, like it was no big deal. We were eating dinner, one of the rare nights Adrian joined us in person. My mom mentioned, almost in passing, that they'd finalized the financial shift to help Adrian move. She said it while passing the salt, like she was talking about switching cable providers. I felt my throat tighten. I asked what she meant by finalized. My dad sighed, like I was exhausting him, and explained that they'd redirected my college fund. Not loaned, not temporarily borrowed. Redirected. The words sounded neat and responsible, like it erased the fact that it had ever been meant for me. He said it was already done, paperwork signed, money allocated. He told me this was a family decision and that I needed to be flexible. I looked at Adrian, waiting, hoping for him to say something, to object, to at least look uncomfortable. He met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. He said quietly, "I didn't ask for this, Nico," which somehow hurt more than if he had. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just stood up, took my plate to the sink, and went back to my room. I locked the door behind me and slid down against it until I was sitting on the floor. That was the moment it hit me fully. I wasn't just overlooked. I was expendable. The fall wasn't dramatic. There was no single night where everything collapsed. It was slower than that, which made it worse. I started sleeping too much or not at all. I skipped meals without meaning to. My grades slipped just enough to draw concern from teachers, but not enough for anyone at home to notice. Theater, once my anchor, started feeling fragile. I worried constantly about the future, about money, about college, about whether I'd made a huge mistake believing I could build a life around something my own family didn't respect. There were nights I stared at my ceiling and wondered if they were right, if I was unrealistic, if I should have been more like Adrian, picked something safe, something impressive, something my parents could brag about. That doubt crept in quietly and made itself comfortable. The lowest point came when I opened my email and saw an acceptance letter from a small performing arts program I'd applied to almost as a long shot. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I felt sick. Tuition numbers swam on the screen. I knew, immediately, that I couldn't afford it. Not without loans. Not without help I no longer had. I sat there for a long time, cursor hovering over the screen, thinking about all the rehearsals, all the nights I'd stayed late perfecting scenes, all the hope I'd poured into something that now felt impossibly far away. I closed my laptop and didn't tell anyone about the acceptance. Not my parents. Not my friends. It felt too painful to say out loud. What pulled me out of that spiral wasn't some grand revelation. It was exhaustion. I got tired of feeling small. Tired of waiting for validation that wasn't coming. One afternoon, while helping clean out old props at the theater, my drama teacher asked me what my plans were after graduation. I gave her the same vague answer I'd been giving everyone else. She studied me for a moment, then said, "You don't sound like someone who's given up. You sound like someone who's been pushed." Something about that stuck. She started talking to me about options I hadn't considered. Scholarships I could apply for independently. Community theater connections. Work-study programs. She didn't sugarcoat how hard it would be, but she also didn't dismiss it as unrealistic. For the first time in months, someone spoke to me like my goals were real. That conversation didn't fix everything overnight, but it lit something small and stubborn inside me. I started researching on my own. Late nights, tabs open across my laptop, spreadsheets of possibilities. I looked into local theater gigs. I applied for grants. I found part-time jobs that fit around rehearsals. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow and uncertain. But it was mine. At home, I kept my plans to myself. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. My parents didn't ask many questions anyway. They were busy helping Adrian settle into his new life, busy talking about his apartment, his commute, his future. The less they knew about my efforts, the safer they felt. I took a job at a small cafe near campus. It didn't pay much, but it was steady. I saved everything I could. I learned how to budget because I had no other choice. There was something oddly empowering about it. For the first time, my progress wasn't measured against Adrian's milestones. It was measured against yesterday's version of me. The emotional distance between me and my family grew wider, but quieter. There were no more arguments because I stopped trying to be heard. When my dad gave unsolicited advice, I nodded and moved on. When my mom asked about my future in that vague, non-committal way, I said I was figuring things out. Adrian called occasionally, usually to update me on his job. I listened politely, then ended the call early. The rise, when it started, was subtle enough that I almost missed it. It was the moment I realized I wasn't constantly angry anymore. I was focused, busy, tired in a way that felt earned. I started getting small wins, callbacks, positive feedback, opportunities that had nothing to do with my family's approval. Each one felt like proof that I hadn't imagined my potential. Then, one evening, I came home from work to find a large envelope on the kitchen counter with my name on it. My mom was sitting at the table, expression unreadable. My dad stood nearby, arms crossed. The atmosphere felt heavy, deliberate, important. She told me they needed to talk. Again, as I picked up the envelope, I had a sudden, sharp sense that whatever was inside wasn't just information. It was another move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And this time, I knew I couldn't keep pretending not to notice. I didn't open the envelope right away. I don't know why, but something in me understood that once I did, there would be no going back to pretending. So I held it in my hands for a few seconds longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper inside. My name was written neatly on the front in my mom's handwriting, the same careful script she used for birthday cards and thank you notes. That detail almost made me laugh. My dad cleared his throat. My mom said my name softly, like she was bracing for me to react badly. I finally opened the envelope and slid the contents out onto the table. It was a formal letter, legal-looking, dense with language that took a second to process. Halfway through the first paragraph, my stomach dropped. It wasn't about college. It wasn't an apology. It was a notice. They had refinanced the house. More specifically, they had used the house I grew up in, the one they'd always referred to as the family home, as collateral to help Adrian secure a better loan for a business venture tied to his job. The letter explained the terms in cold, precise detail. Signatures at the bottom confirmed it was already done. I looked up at them slowly. My dad started talking immediately, explaining why this made sense, how it was a strategic move, how Adrian's career trajectory justified the risk. My mom added that this didn't affect me directly, that it was all very safe, very responsible. She said it like she was trying to soothe a child. I asked one question. Just one. I asked what would happen if Adrian's venture didn't work out. There was a pause. Too long. My dad said they didn't expect that to happen. My mom said it was important to be optimistic. Neither of them answered me. That night, I lay awake replaying every conversation I'd had with them over the past year. The missed play, the redirected college fund, the quiet decisions made without me. A pattern emerged that I hadn't wanted to see before. This wasn't favoritism driven by love alone. It was investment. They were betting on Adrian because he fit the version of success they understood. Everything else, including me, was a secondary consideration. For the first time, the anger I felt wasn't sharp or explosive. It was calm, focused, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I asked for copies of everything. Calmly, politely. I said I wanted to understand the family's financial situation, especially if it might affect my future. My dad looked surprised, then vaguely impressed, like I'd finally shown some maturity. He agreed, probably thinking transparency would make me fall in line. He underestimated how observant I'd become. Over the next few weeks, I read everything. Loan agreements, emails, notes scribbled in margins. I didn't understand all of it at first, but I understood enough. Enough to realize how much they'd leveraged, how little margin there was for error, and how dependent the entire plan was on Adrian continuing to succeed without interruption. I also started talking to people. Quietly. My drama teacher put me in touch with a friend of hers who worked in arts administration. That connection led to another, and then another. I learned about contracts, grants, clauses, and contingencies. At the cafe, one of my regular customers turned out to be a retired accountant. We talked casually at first, then more seriously. I asked hypothetical questions. He gave thoughtful answers. Every piece of information felt like a brick. Slowly, I was building something solid under my feet. At home, I didn't change my behavior much. That was intentional. I kept my head down. I stayed polite. I let my parents assume I was still uncertain, still drifting, still the same kid who would eventually need rescuing. Adrian visited occasionally, always busy, always confident. He talked about his projects with enthusiasm. I listened carefully, asked neutral questions, filed away details. The opportunity to shift things came sooner than I expected. One evening, my dad announced that Adrian would be moving again. A bigger role, more responsibility. It was framed as an upgrade, but I caught the tension underneath. My mom started talking about timelines and paperwork. They needed things to move quickly. Certain documents needed signatures. Certain arrangements needed cooperation. That was when my dad looked at me and said they might need my help. I asked how. He said there were some family assets that would be easier to manage if everything was aligned. He said it casually, but I knew what he meant. They wanted my consent, my signature, something that would make their plan smoother and safer. I didn't answer right away. I asked for time to think. That night, I met with my drama teacher and the retired accountant separately. I showed them the documents I was being asked to consider. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. Both of them reacted the same way, quiet concern, followed by careful questions. They helped me see angles I hadn't fully considered, risks my parents hadn't acknowledged, leverage I didn't realize I had. For the first time, the imbalance of power shifted slightly. I started preparing in earnest. I organized my paperwork. I documented conversations. I kept copies of emails. I made notes after every discussion at home, writing down what was said and by whom. Not out of paranoia, but clarity. I wanted facts, not feelings, to guide me. I also reached out to Adrian directly, not confrontationally. I asked him how he was handling the pressure. I said I knew a lot was riding on his success. He laughed it off at first, then admitted things were more stressful than he'd expected. He didn't go into details, but he didn't need to. I could hear the strain beneath the confidence. When my parents finally sat me down again and asked for my decision, I told them I was willing to help, but only if I fully understood what I was agreeing to. I asked specific questions. I requested revisions. I suggested conditions. They were surprised. My dad looked annoyed. My mom looked nervous. They said I was overcomplicating things. I said I was being careful. The conversation ended without a resolution, but something had changed. They no longer spoke to me like an afterthought. They spoke carefully, measured, like they were negotiating. That night, alone in my room, I laid out everything on my desk, documents, notes, timelines. I could see the entire structure of their plan now, clear as day. I could also see exactly where it was weakest. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be decided without me. I didn't spring anything on them right away. If there's one thing theater taught me, it's timing. You don't rush the climax. You let the tension stretch until the audience can't look away. So when my parents asked again for my signature, I said yes. Not immediately, not eagerly. I said yes the way someone says it when they've already made peace with a decision. Calm, reasonable. I told them I'd spoken to a financial advisor through a school connection and that I just wanted one last meeting so everyone was clear on expectations. My dad looked relieved. My mom smiled like she'd finally gotten me back in line. Adrian sent a short text later that night thanking me for being understanding. That message sat on my phone for a long time. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon at the dining room table. My parents were there, Adrian joined on video call, and I brought printed copies of everything. Contracts, notes, amendments. My dad seemed impressed by how organized I was. He said something about me finally taking things seriously. I nodded and let him think that. Then I asked to walk through the agreement line by line. At first, it was just clarification. Definitions, timelines, interest rates. I asked questions no one else wanted to linger on. My dad answered confidently, until he couldn't. When I asked what would happen if Adrian's venture underperformed for more than 12 months, there was silence again. Familiar silence. The kind they used to hope I'd ignore. That's when I slid my own document across the table. I told them that if I was being asked to assume risk, direct or indirect, I needed protection. I explained, calmly, that my signature would only come with conditions. If the house was on the line, then so was transparency. If family assets were being leveraged, then all beneficiaries needed clarity. I proposed an amendment. Any future financial support for Adrian would require proportional allocation for me. Education funds. Living support. No more figuring it out. My dad's expression hardened. He said that wasn't how families worked. I told him that was exactly how families worked when one child wasn't quietly sacrificed for another. The room changed after that. My mom started wringing her hands. Adrian's face on the screen went tight. He said I was being dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just kept pointing to the numbers, the risks, the imbalance. I reminded them that my college fund was already gone, redirected without my consent, that this was not a pattern I was willing to continue. My dad said if I didn't sign, I'd be hurting the family. I said if I did sign without safeguards, I'd be hurting myself. Then I did the thing they never expected. I withdrew my consent entirely, not with anger, with a simple sentence. I said I wouldn't be signing anything that day, or any day, unless the terms reflected equal respect and protection. I stood up, gathered my papers, and went to my room. I didn't slam doors. I didn't argue further. I let the silence do the work. What followed was chaos. The next week was a blur of tense dinners, whispered conversations, and frantic phone calls. Adrian's venture hit a snag. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to expose how thin the margin really was. Without my signature, certain refinancing options were off the table. Timelines slipped. Stress mounted. My parents tried everything. Guilt, reason, nostalgia. My mom cried one night, saying she didn't recognize me anymore. My dad accused me of being selfish. Adrian called, frustrated, saying I was making things harder than they needed to be. I listened. I didn't budge. Behind the scenes, I kept building my own life. I accepted a spot in a smaller program with strong connections and flexible costs. I secured a partial scholarship. I lined up work. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. Most importantly, it was mine. The breaking moment came when my dad finally admitted, late one night, that they couldn't sustain the risk they'd taken. The house, their savings, everything hinged on Adrian's continued ascent. He didn't say it as an apology. He said it as a fact. I told him I understood. And then I told him I wouldn't be the safety net they expected. That conversation didn't end well. He said things he couldn't take back. My mom sat quietly, tears streaking down her face. Adrian didn't call for a while after that. The fallout was slow but undeniable. They had to unwind parts of their plan. Sell assets. Downsize expectations. Adrian's venture survived, but barely, and not without consequences. The golden glow around him dulled. For the first time, my parents saw him struggle in a way they couldn't fix with optimism or money. Our relationship didn't recover in the way people like to imagine. There were no grand apologies, no sudden realizations. But something fundamental shifted. They stopped asking me to sacrifice. They stopped assuming my flexibility was infinite. Months later, as I packed for my move, my mom stood in my doorway and asked if I was proud of myself. I told her yes. Not because I'd won, not because anyone else had lost, but because for the first time in my life, I hadn't disappeared to make someone else shine. And when I walked out of that house with my bags, I didn't feel like the child who'd been left behind. I felt like someone who finally mattered to himself.